I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for our conference. Professor Eddie Lazear is a professor at Stanford Business School, also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. So yesterday, if you didn't know, was Eddie Lazear Day at Texas A&M. He was our Dean's Distinguished Scholar at the Mays Business School, and we really got a lot of value out of him. We had him speak almost for 12 hours straight, standing up. It was very entertaining and it was very informative for all of us. Just as if you don't know Eddie yet, he is the guy in labor and personnel economics. He's a giant in the field. Spent most of his career at the University of Chicago, landmark papers in mandatory retirement and tournaments. Now he's at Stanford. I think the one way to measure that when you've made it is if you ask Alexa, if you have an Alexa, when is Edward Lazear's birthday, she will answer. And that's a signal. It's true. I knew it every year in August. I'm like, when is his birthday? And I ask Alexa, and she tells me.
Really?
Yeah, you should try that.
That's kind of creepy.
It's a little creepy. Yeah, it's a little creepy. But that's it. You've made it if that happens. So thank you, Eddie, for talking to us about the future of productivity and wages.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, this is obviously it's a terrific topic. It's a big topic. It's what everybody's thinking about. Every university has a project on this stuff. Paul and I are involved in one at Stanford. And so what I want to do is, since this is a lunch talk, I'm supposed to make it a little bit bigger and grander and looser and a little more BS actually. So I'll try to do that. I'm pretty good at that BS part of it. So let me try to do it. Let me start with what I think is the ultimate question or questions. The two big questions that everybody's worried about here are first, will there be work in our economy for everybody to do in the future? Everybody's worried about, are there going to be jobs available for the people? And if you're an economist, can you guys hear me okay, or you want me to use this, or is it you can hear me even without this pretty well? Yeah, pretty well. Okay. And if you're an economist, that sounds like kind of a stupid question, because of course there's going to be work. We know that if there's supply, what's going to happen is the wage rate will fall or adjust so that everybody who wants to be employed will be employed. So it's not really a question of whether there'll be jobs. It's a question of what will the wages be that are necessary to clear those jobs. And people are actually pretty worried about that issue. Will this mean increased inequality, and what can we do about that? And then the second aspect of that is, if you think that the structure of the labor market is going to change over time, the issue is going to be, well, how can we get ready for that? So if the nature of technological change is going to be such that certain jobs are going to be favored relative to other jobs, maybe our educational institutions aren't well set up for that right now. Maybe we better be thinking about how to structure things differently in the future. So essentially what I'm going to argue is that almost all of this is really about productivity, and even the people who think that there won't be jobs in the future are really thinking of this in terms of productivity, even if somewhat loosely. So what I'd like to do is to talk about this in an historical context. Obviously, we have to use historical data because we don't have data from the future. That's kind of definitionally true. That's why it's called the future. So what I'm going to try to do is say, well, look, this is not the first time that the economy has undergone significant technological change. In fact, it's probably not even the most pronounced technological change. I always think of, when people talk about this stuff, I say, gee, it's really hard to imagine anything that was a bigger change than the move from human and animal power to machine power that occurred in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution. That's got to be about as big a shift as anything that we've ever seen. Because, for 10,000 years we were doing it one way, and then, within a 20, 30-year period, we kind of switched to doing it another way. So that's a pretty big shift. But even in the last 3 decades or so, the stuff that you guys were talking about this morning, starting with Susan's stuff, even in the last 3 decades, we've seen a lot of technological change. And so the question is, if we study that, if we look at that, are there any lessons that we can draw from that? A lot of this has been put in terms of the kinds of topics actually that have already come up. Skill bias, technical change, has trade affected this? Some of the things we could think of in terms of the educational institutions. But it all comes down to really what's going to happen to productivity and how's the productivity distribution going to shift over time. So what I want to do is just give you a little bit of historical perspective on this. Many of you know some of these data. Some of you don't know it all. So some of this will be a bit of a review, and the guts of the talk really, it comes at the end, because what I'll be trying to do is infer what happened to productivity by educational group. And the difficulty with doing that is that we don't observe productivity at the individual level very often. We do it, in certain, sometimes you can do it. Chris and I and Catherine Shaw have a couple of papers together where we can really measure productivity in a detailed way for individuals, but we can't link it to their demographics, and it's certainly not general. It's one particular firm, so doing this at kind of a general level is tough to do. So what I'm going to argue is the way to do this is to look at what's happened to industries over time and relate that to the education of those industries. And that's what I'm going to do by linking CPS ASIC data that gives you information on the education in the industry and link that to the productivity data and show you what I find. And then we can ask, is that explaining the wages, and what does that predict about the future in terms of wages and productivity? Okay? So that's where we're going. All right. So the themes, again, that just to go over it very quickly, what I'm going to argue is basically everything is productivity determined, that you don't need anything other than productivity to explain what's going on. So there's a lot of stuff right now on this stuff about our labor markets becoming more monopolistic or more monopsonistic over time. I'm going to say, well, I'm not going to address that directly, but I'm going to argue you don't need that. Basically, there's plenty of stuff in the productivity numbers that can generate the kinds of things that we're seeing out there. The obvious thing that I mentioned earlier is that productivity growth has not been uniform across groups. And I'm also going to claim, and this is the most important thing, that we can more than explain the growth in the skill differential by growth in the productivity differential. So that's what's new in this paper, most new. Okay. So let me talk about technologies, a little bit of math here. I don't really want to talk too much about the math. Most of this stuff is pretty familiar stuff. The first one is just to say, well, if you have a production function, when would we expect wages to move one-for-one with productivity? The easiest way to do that is just think of some kind of neutral shift, like a shift in the technological parameter A, let labor and capital be fixed, and then you basically get that everything's one-for-one. What people are worried about is actually the second type of technology. And I want to tell you a little story from my childhood. My childhood is earlier than most of your childhood. And I think this is what the people who are worried about AI are really thinking about. So once upon a time, in the 50s, 40s, and 50s, 50s is my childhood, 50s and 60s, grocery stores were different kinds of places. You'd go into a grocery store, particularly small ones, mom and pops, and you would bring all the food items to the cash register. Oh, that's just outside. Okay. What is that? Oh yeah. Is that this? Yeah. Oh, okay. Anyway, you'd bring all the food items up to the counter, and then what would happen is the cashier would have literally a pencil, and they would write down all the prices, usually on the paper bag, and then they'd add it up, and then you'd give them the money, and then they'd take that number, and then they would subtract the amount from that, and then that would be your change, and they'd give you the change. Now, that was a pretty skilled job, and the reason it was a pretty skilled job is that, first of all, you had to be pretty facile with arithmetic. Second, you had to have a pretty good memory because we didn't have scanners in those days, and so what happened was, you'd actually have to remember a lot of the prices in the stores. So retail clerks were actually scanner did was it completely changed the nature of the technology. Now you don't have to add it up by yourself. You don't have to remember the prices. It's completely different. You don't have, you have to make change. All you have to do is know, if someone actually, most of the time they give you a credit card, but if they give you a real dollar bill, I guess you have to know what a quarter is and a dime and that kind of stuff. But other than that, you don't have to have a lot of skill. So that's what people are worried about. They're worried about technology that is substitutable for a whole class of labor, because now what used to be a skilled labor type, you don't need those guys anymore. Everybody can be an unskilled labor type. So that's what. So that's what the. We went back and now no action here. Okay. I think. Let's see. We are dead. Yeah. All right. While you're doing that, I'll just tell you. So that second production function is just an example. Good job. Okay, go back. Yep, there. Okay, so the second production function is an example of moving from one kind of technology to another, and you don't have to worry about the details there. But this is the old days, where you had unskilled workers, and then you had the retail clerks who were skilled workers. Then what happens is, over time you have a scanner, and so now all workers are the same. You don't have skilled and unskilled. Anybody can kind of run this across a scanner. And so what I did was I worked out an equilibrium, just a numerical example, but I worked out an equilibrium and said what happens in that kind of a world. What happens is both kinds of labor end up with lower wages. Capital, actually, its return goes down. Where does the money go? The money goes to the inventor of the scanner. They capture all the rents, and that's what people are basically worried about. That the technologists will capture all the rents, everybody else gets screwed. Okay, so this is just a particular technological example of the story that I just told you. All right, so question is, what's happened over time? What kind of technology is actually going on? And what I'm going to claim is that this is basically what's happened. So if we think about this narrow distribution over here, that was productivity in the old days being 1989, in some years 1990, in other years. And this is the productivity distribution now. So it's a couple of things that happen. Obviously, productivity has increased on average, but the shape has changed. It's gotten skewed and higher variance. And so you got a higher upper tail, and so the 90th percentile has moved up by more than the 10th percentile. Simple as that. And again, that squares with everything we know, not just from this paper, but from the whole literature on what's happened to skill differentials and to the inequality distribution over time. Okay, so let me give you some history. So I'll show you some data. I'm going to use a few different data sets here. This one comes from the OECD. They have really good data. The one thing, if you've never, how many people have worked with OECD data? Raise your hand. Probably a lot of you, right? Not so many. Okay. Well, the good thing about OECD data, I used to have to go to the OECD. Those guys used to drive me crazy. So when I actually had, I once had this job, and the government job, and when I had this government job, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors of the United States is ex officio the chairman of the OECD meetings. Okay, so I had to be the chairman of the OECD meetings. And you talk about tough duty. You've got to listen to Europeans for 3 days straight talking about nothing. Okay? So that was really bad stuff. But the good stuff is the OECD is really very good at harmonizing data. So if you ever want data across countries that are consistent, they're probably the best, not probably, they are the best organization in the world for doing that, and they have the most reliable data. So I've used their data in a number of different contexts, and much of what I'm going to show you here is based on the OECD data. Okay, so this is just a scatter plot of log productivity. Productivity defined as standard labor productivity, just total output per hour. And this is by country, and what you have here is the log of the average wage per country, again using the OECD numbers. And what you see from this scatter plot is the obvious thing. Productivity and wages are very closely and positively related to one another. And it won't surprise you if you look at the rich countries like Switzerland, Luxembourg, Norway, up in the right-hand corner. They have, I'm sorry, I'm standing your way here. They have both high wages and high productivity. And it's also true in changes. So that was in levels. It's also true in changes. If you look at, this is a 20-year change, this is 87, 80, this one is, 87 to 17. That's 30-year period. I'm trying to remember which period this is. It should be on here. I guess it's just the last 20 years. Sorry, so it's 17 to back to 20 years behind that. And if you look at those changes, you'll see basically the same relationship. The countries that have had the most rapid changes in productivity have also had the most rapid changes in wages. But what I want you to notice is that if I flip back and forth, while you still have the positive slope, the countries are completely different. So if you look at the countries that are in the northeast corner up here, and you compare those to the countries in the northeast corner up here, they're not the same countries, right? We're looking at Luxembourg, Denmark, Ireland, Switzerland, Iceland, and here what you're looking at is Czech Republic, Slavic Republic, Lithuania, all the countries that moved from command economies to market economies. They're the leaders, so they're the ones that have the big productivity growth. But the point is that you're saying the same kind of relationship over time. And this is just more, this is just kind of a regression version of what I just showed you before. So here it is in levels. Here's log productivity in 2017. There's the log wage in 2017. You rest those on one another and you get a positive slope, actually greater than 1. If you do it in changes, either 5-year changes or 20-year changes, still get a positive coefficient, in that case less than 1, although just not significantly different from 1, but most of the time they're less. This is in levels with country fixed effects, so again we're looking within, we're exploiting the within country variation. Those coefficients look pretty similar, and this is over the entire period, not just the 1 year, clustered at the country level, basically the same thing. So basically, the point of this is no matter how you do it, you're going to get a strong relationship between productivity and wages. That's the bottom line of the first few slides. It's also true for a given country over time. And this is one given country, a country we happen to like a lot, because it's ours. And so if you look at productivity, and wages, I'm using a 4-year moving average here. I guess you guys get used to this stuff. Howdy! I guess you get, so if you look at this 4-year moving average, what you see is that the productivity and compensation index move together. But if you look carefully, particularly in the final years, you'll notice that while they move together, productivity has increased by more than wages. So productivity doesn't quite seem to be keeping up with wages. All right, and so this is just a regression version of the same thing. And so what you have here is just the whole period from 1951 to 2017, 6 observations. And again, I'm looking at the compensation index on productivity. This is the same thing again, but it's a 4-year moving average. And this looks at it once again, but it looks at the later period. And you see the coefficient is slightly lower than it was over the entire period. That's the point that this gap looks bigger here than it did down here, but not statistically significantly different. Okay, but again, the point is that they move together over time. What I'm not going to show you, but I'll just tell you very quickly, is that I did the same thing on a country, and for every one of them, except one, I think it was Portugal, for every one except one, I get a positive significant coefficient, just like I did here, of intertemporal regression of wages on productivity for 34 out of 35 countries. So essentially what you're seeing for the U.S. is mirrored by all of the countries in the OECD data, exactly the same stuff. Okay? So productivity and wages move together. So that's kind of good, because that says, gee, there's an easy solution to this problem. All we need to do is make sure that we increase productivity and everybody will live happily ever after. Right? So no big deal. Okay. Well, that's looking at it at the averages, and that's looking at the typical person. But of course, what everybody's worried about when they think about this problem of AI and the future of jobs is they're thinking about the inequality aspect. And how many people in here read, when you were in high school or something, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, 1932 publication? Most of us, all right? Well, I don't know if you had, it's probably a long time ago, so you probably don't remember. But in there, he had castes. There were 5 castes, and they went from alphas to epsilons. And remember, people were created. For those of you who haven't read that book, didn't get it assigned in high school. The people were created, and they were made in test tubes, and they were made into different castes. And so you were either born an alpha or you were born an epsilon. And what people are worried about is that we're never going to have jobs that the gammas, deltas, and epsilons can do. There's just not going to be any work for them. Or the way Paul always likes to put this, in a slightly more economic way, is that the reservation value, the value of leisure for those guys will be higher than the value of their productivity. It's not that they couldn't possibly work. Obviously, they could work, but they're going to be so unproductive that it just won't pay for them to work because staying at home has a higher value than actually going to work. Okay? So, and by the way, before I take you through this tour, this is important because this is what the Silicon Valley guys all believe. Okay? So, we have a presidential candidate who believes exactly this. Zuckerberg believes exactly this, and they feel guilty. They feel really guilty because they know that they're such geniuses that what they produce will put everybody out of work, and then they're thinking, what are we going to do about those guys? And the answer is universal basic income. Okay. So, I'm saying that in kind of a joking way, but I'm not joking. That is really the, if you strip away what they're saying, that's actually the view. The view is that the technology that they're inventing will be so transformative that it will essentially change the labor market in ways that will lower the productivity of the bottom X part of the distribution so much that it won't pay for those guys to work. And so that's the nature of the argument. So the question is it true? And we don't know whether it's true. It's possible. That's the future of work. That's why you have a conference. But we can look at a period during which we have had rapid technical change and figure out what's going on and ask how much of this can we account. So let me just show you again. You know a lot of this stuff. Some of you know a lot of this stuff. But let me show you what's happened over time in the United States and then in the OECD countries. The first thing you'll notice, so I have here the 90-50 ratios, the 90th to the median, and then the median to the 10th. And if you look at that, what you see is that there has been growth over time in the 90-50 ratio. That's what most of us talk about when we talk about growing inequality. That the highest wage people are moving up relative to the middle. It's also true a little bit at the middle, but it's mostly, all the action is really 90-50, not 50-10. Now, here's what you want to notice, and this is looking at all the other OECD countries on which I had data over this period. without the United States. So I'm throwing out the United States and I'm looking at the others, and their patterns look pretty similar. Okay, so if you look at this one, obviously, you know, the timing is a little bit different, but the basic story is the same. If you look at the 90-50 over time for the 16 OECD countries here that are not the United States, they too, that 90-50 ratio has grown there in the same way that it's grown here. The levels are a bit different. I don't want to say quite different, but they are different. The U.S. has more inequality to start, and it has more inequality to end than the other 16 countries, but the changes are about the same. So if you look at that, the pattern's about the same. The reason that's important is that, well, I shouldn't say it's important. The reason I think it's worth pointing out is that if you're thinking in terms of institutional stories or monopsony stories or conspiracy stories, that doesn't square very well with that because those are country-specific stories. So if you're kind of saying, you know, somehow the rich guys in the United States have figured out a way to exploit the poor guys, well, they haven't just figured it out in the United States, they figured it out in the UK, they figured it out in Germany, they figured it out in France, and they figured it out across the board. So it's possible, but that doesn't sound like the most plausible explanation. The most plausible explanation is there's something else going on there, and of course the obvious thing that people would think about, something having to do with technology, with trade, or with perhaps education, the nature of education and the educational production process. So those would be three candidates that seem to be a bit more consistent with this. I want to point out a couple of other things, because the issue is, what do we have to explain? What does the productivity data have to explain? And if you look at this, and I don't mean to be getting on the Cambridge guys, but this sort of came up when I kind of discovered this by accident, and I thought, gee, what's going on here? You know, there's been a lot of talk about polarization and hollowing out of the labor force and so forth. And the truth is, you don't really see that. It was a short, you do see it, but it was a short-run phenomenon. It's actually when David Autor and Mermain and Levy wrote their first paper. That was actually true. So you see what happened here? Look at the 50-10. The hollowing out is the fact that the median, the middle guys, lost relative to the top guys and the bottom guys. That's the hollowing out story. And that's true. So if you look at that initially, you see that the median is falling relative to the 10th percentile, and the 90th is still, you know, it's either staying constant or it's growing. But it started to come back already by around 2000, and by the time you get to 2005, that whole hollowing out stuff has kind of gone back to where it was. So a better story, so a better story is this one, which is that what's really happened is the top half of the distribution has moved away from the bottom half of the distribution. And the farther you are away from the median, the more you've moved up. So if you think about this, this is basically flat. So what this essentially says is that over a long period of time, the median and the 10th percentile have moved pretty much lockstep. And they haven't moved very much at all. This is the ratio of where they were in 2017 to where they were in 1990. And that ratio has stayed about constant for everybody up to the 50th percentile. But then if you get up here to the 90th percentile, the ratio of their 2017 wage to the 90th percentile in 1990, that ratio is way higher. So essentially what this tells you is that the top is moving away, not from the poor, but from the whole bottom half. It's basically 50% are getting left where they were, and the top is moving away. So that's really what needs to be explained. That's what we need to try to rationalize. Okay, so how are we going to do that? This is kind of an interesting slide. Who are these guys anyway? Who are these people in the top 90, in the 90th percentile? So those are, I took the people between 87.5 and 92.5 percentile and said which occupations are account for the bulk of those people. And you got about 23% of them are managers, but half of them are in those other categories: software developers, nurses, supervisors, sales. Supervisors means like frontline, first line supervisors, salespeople, accountants, auditors, public administrators, police, marketing. They don't look like the kinds of people that we're thinking about as in occupations with the power to kind of tweak the whole system or alter the whole system in ways that you think about as monopoly. And remember, the monopoly story has to be, it's not just that there's more monopoly, but it's that there's monopoly in a way that affects the bottom 50%, but not the top 50%, okay, or not as much the top 50%. So it's useful to look at the occupations. Everybody knows, if you talk about the top 1%, who's in the top 1%, the modal occupations in that. Everybody know that if you do the same exercise. So the modal occupations are professionals. That's doctors, lawyers, and us, actually. Believe it or not, educators are in that group. Yeah, because high-level educators are in the top 1%. It's mostly professionals. There's certainly finance people, managers in that group as well. But when you think of the top 1%, when people are actually thinking about the potential exploiters, they would have to be in the top 1/10 of 1%. 1/10 of 1% is about $1.5 million a year. So there are very few doctors, lawyers, and professors who are in that category. Those are the people who are business people and Wall Street finance people. So it really has to be the top 1/10 of 1% that we're talking about to get that. Okay. This is kind of an aside, but I thought I'd show it to you. I got a few minutes, so let me show it to you. This is interesting. This is an issue of intergenerational inequality. It's not quite the same topic. In fact, it's not the same topic at all. But it is, since we're talking about inequality, let me just tell you this. So this has actually been, these numbers have been around for a long time. The people, of course, who brought the most attention to this recently have been Chad E. Hendren, that whole group of researchers. And they have made the point that the correlation between parental income and children's income, or our income and our parents' income, that correlation is higher in the United States by a lot than it is in other countries. That's true. So, for example, if you look at the United States and you say, what's the correlation in the United States? It's about somewhere, depending on which numbers you use, the correlation somewhere between 0.4 and 0.45. If you look at Canada and you say, what's the correlation in Canada, which happens to be at the lowest end, it's something like 0.16, between 0.16 and 0.2, depending on how you do it. So correlation's a lot higher. But there's another way to spin that. So that sounds really bad. Okay, that sounds like, man, where you're born is where you stay. Okay? But we all understand that r is the square root of r squared. And so let's turn that around a little bit and just say the same fact, but say it in a different way. So if I ask how much of my earnings is explained by parental earnings, what that's going to be is it's going to be the regression of my earnings on my parents' earnings. And we already know the correlation is 0.45, so we know that r squared is going to be about 0.22, right? So what that tells you is that 80% of the variation is person-specific or idiosyncratic or not related to parent income, right? It tells you 80% or so. Now, if I do it for Canada, same thing. In Canada, it's almost 96% is unrelated to parental income. But that's not really the interesting story. The interesting story is not that it's 96% versus 80%. The interesting story is it's 80% in the first place. That when we're thinking about this, it's not like, where you're born essentially determines where you'll end up. 80% of what happens to you is idiosyncratic and That's the stronger message, okay? Or to me, that's the message that's been lost in this literature. It has changed a bit over time. It's actually, the correlation's gotten a bit stronger between kids and parents over time. But again, it's still, the bulk of it is still idiosyncratic. There is a bit, by the way, you can do this, you can break this down by groups. There is a bit of more parent-child relationship at the tails of the distribution. So not so much the very wealthy, but even the very wealthy, you see it a bit more. But particularly among the very poor, that correlation is a bit higher. And that's something to worry about. But on average, the point is that, you know, you don't want to get excited about the fact that we're way worse than Canada. The point is, most of this stuff tells you that there's still a lot of stuff we can do to affect people's outcomes during their lifetimes, and it's not like, you know, we're dead given where they're going. Okay, so let me now do the first exercise that's really not the answer to the question, but this is something that I want to show you, which is the relation between different percentiles of the distribution and productivity. So if you said, okay, well, we know average wages move with average productivity, we'd also like to know, how does the 10th percentile move with productivity? How does the 90th percentile move with productivity? So that's what this table does. It basically says, let's look at the 10th percentile and ask, how does that move with productivity? And I want you to look at this column. This has time effects in it, basically, I won't go into the details. But here it looks like it's about 1-to-1. If you look at it, this is in the United States. If you look at it in other OECD countries, again, it's lower, but not necessarily very different from one, but still a bit lower. If you look at the 90th percentile, again, for the US, it's about 1, and for the non-US countries, a little bit lower. But so the point is that the tails are also moving with average aggregate productivity. Okay, but that's and this isn't changed. It's basically the same story. I won't bother you with that set of tables. It's basically the same thing. All percentiles move with aggregate productivity. That's not the interesting question. The question is not, how does a person's wage move with aggregate productivity? The question is, how does a person's wage move with that person's productivity? And that's where I started and said that's pretty hard to get at, because we don't have measures of individual productivity. But what we can do is we can at least look at it by types of persons. And so what I mean by types of persons is education group. And so this is going to be the most important table in the whole paper. And essentially what this says is, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take all the industries that are reported on in the BLS productivity data. They give you industry 3-digit, this is at the 3-digit level. Take the 3-digit industry, match that with the CPS ASIC data so that I can get the education level for that industry. And let me just call that either, I'm going to pretend, of course it's not true, but I'm going to pretend that everybody within an industry has the same level of education. And then I'm going to ask, what's happened to different industries over time? Is it the case that the industries that have educated people have seen a higher increase in productivity over a 20-year or 30-year period than the industries with less educated people? And I'm going to infer from that something about differential productivity over time. That's the whole story. And that's basically what I said is going to be new in this analysis. So that's what this does. And what you see is that productivity and productivity is positively related to education in the industry. Not surprising. It's kind of what we think about, you know, all this discussion of skill bias, technical change. You don't necessarily have to call it skill bias, technical change. It could be trade. You know, Susan talked about the trying to disentangle technology from trade this morning and how difficult that is. In this paper, it's impossible, okay? Because basically what I have is I'm just looking at what's happened to an industry. I know it's an educated industry. I know its productivity has gone up by more than other industries with less educated people, but I don't know if that's because prices of the goods have changed differently as a result of trade. I don't know whether it's because of technology. I don't know whether it's because of education. It could be that our educational system has changed over time in a way that has made the people at the top more productive, but the K through 12 has lagged behind, something like that. All of those are consistent with what we're seeing here. But what's true, again, what's true is that the more educated you are, if you're in an industry with more educated people, you've seen significantly higher productivity growth over the period, over this period. Okay, so what do we want to do? This is the same thing, but I put in demographics. I'm not going to bore you with that. So what do we want to do with that? What we want to do is we want to ask, can productivity explain what we've seen in terms of change in wages? And this slide is a summary, but it's basically the bottom line of the paper. So if you look at this, what it says is look at the two different, what, it's supposed to be orange. Or it looks orange? No, brownish orange. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like maroon and cardinal at times. Okay. All right. So what this tells you is this is the average change in productivity in industries that were high education in 1989. So what do I mean by high? Take all my industries, divide them in two. Are you above the median industry? Are you below the median industry? If you're above the median industry in terms of education, the average education for your industry is above the median, then you're this guy. If you're below the median, then you're this guy. Okay, now if you look at that, what do you see? You see that the average productivity in the high education industries has grown by more than the productivity in the low education industries. Okay? What this side of the picture does is the same thing, same colors, but instead of productivity, what this is looking at is wages. And this is wages in the industry. It's not individual wages. I'll give you individual wages a little bit later on. But this is basically going to be the story. And what you'll see is the same thing was true here. That if you're in an industry that had high levels of education, wages went up by more than in an industry with low levels of education. So they go in the same direction. But the other thing you'll notice, and you don't have to look too carefully, is that the gaps between high and low are way bigger for productivity than they are for wages. And so when I say that's really the punchline, essentially what that says is productivity changes more than account for changes in wages than are necessary, without any stories about monopoly or anything else. Productivity over-explains, in some sense, the changes in wages, at least at this average level. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Is this wages or earnings?
This is the wage rate. Wage rate.
So would incentive pay or stock options or other instruments be included in that?
In theory, yes, because it's BLS data, so it includes when you use it. You got to be careful about that, okay? But when you use this, what they do is they take your total income, which in theory includes self-employment income. They divide by hours and compute the hourly wage that way. So in theory it does, but sometimes that might not. It's a noisy measure, so it might not be. This is what we hang on a sec, Greg. What were you thinking?
Growth and incentive pay that is correlated with ability that may depress measure change in the base wage would
Oh, I see.
show up
In other ways. I see.
in other earnings.
Yeah, I see. Okay, yeah. I would guess that would be a relatively small effect on this, because you're looking. This is across the whole
So does that mean the residual returns are going to capital instead of labor? Is that what it is?
Yeah, well, again, it kind of comes back to the question that was asked yesterday. You got to be a little careful about this. The residual returns are going somewhere, okay? So they're going to capital, but that doesn't mean that the rate of return to capital is higher. In fact, it's been the reverse, right? So apologizing for repeating what I said yesterday, but you want to distinguish prices and quantities when you're talking about capital share. So most of this is a complete digression, but this came up yesterday in a talk I gave. Most of the discussion on capital share going up is kind of has the connotation that capital share is going up because capitalists are making more money on their capital. Okay, that's not what's going on. What's going on is there's more capital. So if you look at the marginal return to capital, we know that's gone down. In fact, that's a thing that everybody's worried about, is that the rate of return, interest rate, the real interest rate has fallen. And people are worried about the fact that the real interest rate's fallen. That's stimulated this whole discussion by Larry Summers, who's resurrected the structural, the secular stagnation argument. That's essentially dealing with this falling rate of return on capital. That's a way to talk about that, or one way to rationalize that. But that's a price times quantity when we're talking about the share. It's not the price. Usually when people are thinking about capitals getting all this money, they're thinking about it in terms of you're getting a higher return to your capital. That's not what's going on. It's that, it may be going on in some situations, but on average what's going on is there's more capital, and so the amount of price times quantity, that's gone up. Okay? But it's quite different in terms of the implications for labor, because if it's the quantity of capital that's gone up, that's not a bad thing for labor, right? If you say, gee, capital share has gone up because we have a lot more capital to work with, that's not a bad thing for labor. Unless it's the retail grocery store kind of technological change, right? And again, that's why I said that's one thing to do. Okay, good. Okay, so let me do this in a slightly more granular way. This is basically going to tell you the same story. There are a lot of numbers on this. Let me just focus on the last two columns. This does essentially the same thing. What it says is, let me look at a group of individuals in 2017 versus that same group in 1989. Let me ask, by how much did their wage go up and by how much did their productivity go up? Okay, that's what I compute. And that's what's in columns 6 and 7. How much did their wage go up? How much did their productivity go up? What we're trying to get at is the skill differential. We're trying to figure out, did the productivity differential by skill go up by more than the wage differential by skill? So what this column does is it says, all right, here's the growth in wages, the difference between the growth in wages for high school or high school grads versus the growth in wages from less than high school. So that's their skill differential. That went up by 0.06. How much did the productivity differential go up by? 1.03. So the number in this column, they're way bigger than the number in this column. That's just another way of saying what I showed you in that picture, but just at a more granular level. It says that productivity differences are way more than enough to explain the wage differences. Yeah, please.
Just a clarifying question. How are you measuring productivity growth by education?
You mean how do I get the education effect, or how do I measure productivity growth?
Productivity growth by education. So I think it's productivity growth by education, but we've got these.
Oh, you mean how did I figure that number out? Where did that number come from? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I jumped. Yeah. So I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Good question. Let me go back. I was a little too quick on that.
Because we can think about it by industry, because there's industry stuff, and then there's.
No, I'll show you. Yeah. Okay, so here it was pretty easy. Here what I did was I said, I know the productivity growth in an industry. I'm just going to split my industries up into high education and low education. Okay. But in the other one, sorry, I jumped too fast. Okay. Here, what I'm doing is I'm saying, gee, I can compute this for any possible hypothetical level of education, because here the level of education that I'm doing it for is 11.79 years of education. How did I get that? I don't see an industry that has 11.79 years of education. How did I get that? And the answer is, I got it from using my estimates in this table, where I look at the effect of education on productivity, and then I just estimate that based on these coefficients. So, yeah, sorry. Good clarifying question. Yeah. Okay, so that's what this says. But again, bottom line is what you see in the picture. Same thing. Essentially what this says is that productivity is more than sufficient to explain the growing wage differentials that we see by scale. Yeah.
And since this is wages and not total compensation, could
Right.
increasing differential benefits explain some more?
Some more of this, yeah. Yeah, because it's a good point, actually, because you'd expect that the more highly educated, we know their level of benefits is higher, but I would also expect that the growth in their benefits would be higher as well. It's kind of like the question I asked Paul this morning when I said we're not taking into account the cost of the car. Remember, and I was bugging you on that. You got a number like $61, and I said, well, it's 45 cents a mile. Still, it'll whittle it down, but it's not gonna come close to closing this gap. This is just way too big relative to, you can make up any reasonable numbers that you want, and I don't think you're gonna come close to explaining that gap. 5 more minutes? Okay. So anyway, I'm done. But here, let me start. I am done, actually. Let me give you so let's go back to where we started. So how did I motivate this talk? I motivated it by saying, what's everybody worried about? What everybody's worried about is that productivity is going to change in a way that's going to make the gammas, deltas, and epsilons obsolete. And so the question is that true? And if it's true, is there anything we can do about that? And so the reason I took you through this whole tour on productivity is it basically says, well, look, productivity is the whole story. So if productivity is the whole story, all we have to do is get the productivity of those epsilons and deltas up, and we got it nailed. That's all we have to do. So the question is, how do we do that? Because even the Zuckerbergs and Silicon Valley guys might grant that. They might say, yeah, if you could do that, then everything's fine. But the problem is, how are you going to do that? How are you going to get those people up to higher levels of productivity? And of course, what do we sell in here? What do all of us sell? Education. So let's pump up education. Okay, let's talk. We've got to, like, talk to a Goldman guy, they'll tell you everything's about, better investment banking. So what we're going to tell you is everything's about better education. But it's a credible argument, and that's what the last slide shows you. The reason it's credible is that you might say, well, those people are uneducable. And that's kind of the way they're thinking about it, if I put it in the crassest terms. That's essentially what they're saying, is that the low guys their productivity can't be brought up. Well, if you look historically, and I'm saying historically meaning really over this tech period, the recent tech period, the 1990 period versus the current period, what you see is that even high school, even just finishing high school, has a higher rate of return today than it did back in 1989 through 91. So high school is more valuable today than it was then. So even that would be a significant improvement. So that suggests that it's not impossible to take the people who are in the lower half of the distribution and to raise their productivity through education. So let me stop there and just leave on that happy note, and we should all publicize that people should buy more of our services. Good. Ready to stop? You go back to work?
A few questions?
Oh, I'll take any questions if you have them. I just thought you want to give people a quick break and go back to work. But whatever you want to do. If there are any, you guys are dying to ask another question, I'm happy to answer. Yeah, go ahead.
So Eddie, let me leave.
I thought you had something in mind. Yeah.
All right, let's do it. That's right. Nice thing about being organized.
Yeah.
let me try to push back and say, and I'll try to push back in economic terms.
Yeah.
And here's the conjecture. And I'm going to frame this in terms of Sherwin Rosen,
Okay.
which is his superstar theory.
Mhm.
And let's say the production function of the economy has changed, so that now software, someone who can build software, for example, is a new technology that has zero marginal cost and can spread across the world and rapidly change industry.
Yeah.
Right? So superstar theory would say that then in that economy, the inventor of that software will be able to create and capture the returns from that invention, and his wages will skyrocket up.
Right.
Okay. So how can you evaluate that conjecture in terms of the data, and is there any truth to that? I mean, because that's sort of,
Yeah.
the newspapers don't talk about Sherman's theory, but that's kind of what
That's what
have
they
in
have.
mind.
Yeah, I don't know if they have superstars in mind. The superstars thing is a huge economies of scale argument.
Right.
I don't think you necessarily, that's one version of it.
Right.
Okay, so you could have huge economies of scale, that would be sufficient, but if you think of like the grocery store technology, that's not an economies of scale story. But it still says that the people at the bottom part of the distribution, or not bottom, the middle part of the distribution, what used to be a skilled retail clerk in the 50s, those people are not going to be valuable in the future. So a scale economy will do it, but so will that. So any one of those stories is consistent. Now, obviously, I can't, these data don't speak to that, because that's something that we really haven't seen happen. The reason that I sort of took you through this is that what I thought was useful about this exercise and why it does relate to the future is that it does I think, to my mind, reasonably convincingly demonstrate that wages are not capricious, that they are linked to productivity, okay? So the answer to your question is, yeah, if the technology is such that there is no way ever to figure out ways for the deltas and epsilons to do anything that's productive, or again, in Paul's sort of better way of putting it, that their productivity will be so low relative to the alternative use of their time that you don't even want them to work, we're screwed, okay? Unless we can affect their productivity. And so what I take out of this, and basically the whole message, is we better be thinking about an educational system that figures out ways to increase the productivity for the gammas, deltas, and epsilons. Because if we don't do that, what you're worried about could actually happen. But if we can figure out a way to deal with that and say we need to compress the skill distribution. The problem is right now the skill distribution is spread out. But that's not exogenous. We can compress the skill distribution by bringing the bottom up to the top, and the question is how do you do that? So I'm going to end on this note because I want to get back to work on time. My hobby horse on this stuff is essentially vocational education. Okay? And the reason is it's actually, that's database. If you look at the structure of wages in the German-speaking countries, which are the ones that are known for the best vocational education, you look at their wage structure, what you see is people who have finished vocational school in Germany do way better relative to the college graduates than people who have even finished high school in the United States relative to college graduates, let alone the people who are high school dropouts. Forget about them. But even just looking at high school versus vocational. So vocational training stuff has a lot of problems associated with it. They track these guys really early and so forth. But the point is that what they're doing is they're giving them skills that make them productive when they get into the labor force. And so the German skill distribution, I would infer from their wage distribution, is more compressed than the American skill distribution. And so, one thing that we ought to be thinking about is moving more in that direction. And by the way, I always have to mention this. When I say vocational, we always think about plumbers and carpenters and manufacturers. In Germany, most of their jobs are services. They're 70% services. So when they're training you for vocational training, most of it is service jobs. And, some of it's manufacturing, but most of it is service jobs. It's teaching you how to be a hotel clerk or a manager in a retail store or something like that. But those people are way more productive when they come out than our typical high school graduate, which essentially gives you kind of a watered down academic
thinking about policy, that's where I